Hi everyone, this is just my little video as promised, just to show you a little bit more detail on my Rockpool drawing. So I'm just going to show you first of all little bits of it and just kind of talk you through it a little bit, and then I'm going to do little sections of it that you might find interesting. Just to say in advance, when I'm actually doing the drawing, I'll be talking you through it. You might hear my husband's voice talking maths because he's teaching online in the next room. So you never know, you might get a lesson on shapes and angles as well. Just a bonus. So, here we go. This is the photograph. So this is one of my photographs taken at Kimmeridge. And as you can see, you've got all of the rocks and the pebbles distorted in the patterns in the water. So I thought, crikey, this is going to be a challenge, but it'll be interesting to do. And yes, it is a challenge. If you've not done water before, I would say it's possibly one of the hardest things to draw photorealistically. That said, obviously there are so many different ways you can do water. You can use various different materials, and it depends on the type of water that you're drawing as well. And those of you that have done my nature course will have covered all these various different approaches. But I'm just going to talk today about how I did this one photorealistically. So here's my drawing. Okay, so basically it's a case of drawing out the shapes that you see. I started at the top here, and then I worked my way down to the bottom, and then I worked my way across, working on the middle. And this is the section that I'm thinking of showing you today, so that you can see how to get this little bit of water. If I show you on there, on the photograph, how to get that effect by using pencils and also using tortillons and stumps and pointed tip eraser. It's really a case of working on it in small sections at a time. Don't draw out all of the patterns on the whole thing because it will just drive you mad. Kind of just work on a section at a time. And although it's best to kind of work away from yourself so you're not smudging, what I tend to do is draw out a little section, shade it, then draw out another little section, shade it, another section, shade it, and then move on. But that's not to say I don't go back and correct as I go, because when you do the next bit, that obviously has an impact on the bit you've just done. So you might have to go darker, you might have to go lighter, you might have to take something out. I think the main thing to think about with water though when you're doing something like this is when you start, because you're just doing shapes, it just looks like a load of random patterns and it doesn't actually look like water. So when you start, it can be quite dispiriting because you're thinking, oh, I just can't see it. And it's not until you've got a fair bit in that all the elements come together and then you can see it for what it is. And unfortunately, that just really comes with experience, because when you're starting doing this, you haven't done it before, you could unfortunately think that you're going wrong, and you might not be going wrong, it's just that you just haven't done enough of it. So one key thing to do to help is to stand back and look at it from a distance, because you get a much, much better perspective of it when you do that. And also make sure that your photo reference that you're working from is really, really clear, because you can't guess with something like this. It has to be right, really. What else can I say at this point? Pencils that I used throughout the whole thing were between 4H and up to 2B. I didn't go beyond 2B. And on the rock here, you can see there's a little bit of texture. So that was using the pencils on the side and then squircling into it. And then using a used tortillon to kind of blend. You can see a little bit on these down the bottom as well there, because there's not that much definition. It's slightly out of focus, so I've slightly used Tortolin just to sort of do a lot of the work on them. Whereas in these areas, there's a lot of intense pencil work. And the main thing you've got to do when you're drawing the shapes and the patterns is you have to outline the shapes because they've got to stand out, but also you don't really want to have too many heavy lines without shading next to them, because then it doesn't look like water, it doesn't look fluid. So it's a case of constantly blending all your strokes, like on here, using a pointed tip eraser to take out, using a stump or a Tortolin to blend as well, because that will get rid of the pencil lines if any pencil lines show up. And then eventually, if you keep doing that throughout the whole thing, it kind of comes together, we hope. So, that's just a little introduction to it, just to show you just an overview. And now I'll get on and do a little bit for you just to show you how to do this section up here. Okay, see you in a bit. Right, hello again. As you can see, I've got the part of the picture that I'm doing really close to where I'm actually working, which is essential because you will lose your place. I have done several times. So what I've basically done is put all the darker areas in first, because they're the bits that stand out most of all, and so therefore I can see where I'm going. Then I've put in the mid-tones and then the lighter tones, and I've in the area on here you've got lighter areas where the light's hitting the ripples, so I'm kind of leaving those light, and then I'm going in between them. So the next thing I'm going to do is use a Tortolin, because when you do this to start with, you get, obviously you're going to get pencil lines because you're using a pencil. You can't really avoid that, but because it's water, you don't really want to see that. So I use a Tortolin just to soften some of my pencil lines. I'm going to have to go over this as well because it's got to be darker. But I periodically just do this just so I get it back to smooth. And then I can work into it. Okay, so clearly needs to be quite a lot darker on that, on several sections on there. So I'm going to go in with an HB. I've used 2B on here, 2B on here, there's B, there's H, there's 3H, just to get something in. Now I'm going to go in with HB on this section. At the moment I've got it set up so that you can see, hopefully see the bit that I'm working on from, but then in a bit I will zoom in a little bit so that you can actually see the detail. It does need a very steady hand. And you are going to get through an awful lot of Tortolins when you do this. So, the other thing I found is that when I do one bit, then as I said earlier, I then have to go back and work on another bit because that affects it. So now, as I'm doing this bit, I can see I need to be a little bit darker on here. And yes, there are times where I think, oh God, I'm in the wrong bit. And there are times when you're doing this and you think, why did I start this? But hopefully it's worth it in the end. And actually, while you're doing it, you kind of zone out, and we all know that those of us that draw all know that feeling, hopefully, when you're doing it, that you sort of get into the zone. And the nice thing about this sort of thing is that it really, although yes, I'm saying that it has got to look right and you have got to get things in the right place, it's you don't have quite the same pressure that you do, say, if you're trying to get somebody's likeness when you're doing a portrait. It's just really, you kind of, the way I approach doing this sort of thing is just to sort of blank my mind and just do what I see and just separate all the different tones out and just literally just do exactly what the tones are. And then after a while, and I generally, I haven't at the moment because I'm filming this, but generally I have the radio on, I listen to plays, I listen to debates, I listen to loads of different podcasts, and I'm kind of in my own little world, and it's just nice to do. There does come a point where I think, right, okay, I think I'm going to have to stop now because I will go cross-eyed if I don't. And then I have to move away, and I generally go out in the garden. And I can only sit and do this for so long anyway because of my back, so it's just a case of doing a little bit at a time, and then eventually you get through it, and eventually you get, that sounds like it's a chore, but you do eventually get through it, and you get through, and you've got enough in that you can see what you've done. Notice just actually here, these sections I've left white, but actually they are not white. Some of them are slightly off white, but I'm leaving them as white as long as I can so that I can get the tone in between right, and then if I need to go back over them, I can do. Here, so I can see, I don't know if you can see, but I've actually got, you might be able to see when I zoom in later, I've actually got a kind of a map underneath here of the patterns so that I can see where I'm going, because if I make it up as I go, I get into a terrible muddle and it doesn't work, it doesn't kind of fit together. So laborious as it is always better to draw it out first, and I would say that's kind of the case with everything really. If you're doing portraits, you've got to draw it out first, get the likeness, get everything in, get that drawing out stage done first, check it, double check it, triple check it, and then once you know that you've got that right, you can then get to the more fun section that everybody wants to get to, which is the shading in. But you store up a whole load of problems for yourself if you get in there too soon without checking everything first. I have found through experience. As I said earlier, there are loads of different ways of doing water. On the nature course we've done using charcoal. We've done a little bit more impressionistic. It depends on the scale that you're doing as well, and how much detail you're putting in. You can use graphite powder for certain things. So if you were doing a sea scene, for instance, a beach scene, you wouldn't do it like this in necessarily quite the same way as this, because this is so close up and so detailed. So, and all of them are nice in their own way, really. I think it's nice to experiment with different things and just see what you like. It may be that this sort of detail, I mean, I know a lot of my students do love this sort of detail, but sometimes it's good to do something a little bit different. So maybe have a go, if you want to have a go at doing something detailed like this, and then move up and change and do something a bit more loose. If you've got pictures of beaches, water scenes or something, just have a play around. With everything, it's all experimentation. Doesn't always come first time, but you know, you've got to try it to find out. Okay, so I'm going to stop on that bit and then come in close on the photograph and actually on there so that you can see the detail. And then I'm going to pull back to show you, and then you should be able to see, as I can, where I need to go in darker, where I need to blend a bit more. Yeah, so I'll just do that in a sec. Right, so if you look on here and I go in close, you can see the little white areas in between that I was talking about. And then if I go to my drawing, you can see that's what I've done there. And then if I pull out from a distance, and then look at the other one to compare, you can see there needs to be a lot more depth. And I need to go over those whiter areas while still making them a little bit lighter. And then once I get this section in here, I think then the whole thing will look more fluid, because you're going to have that sort of rhythm coming along here. When you've just got a section in and a section in, it just looks a bit disjointed. So once you've got enough in, I think it will show up. Okay, let's go out a little bit further. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to do a little bit more depth in here, and I'm going to get a fresh tortillon just to blend out. And then I use a tortillon to push through horizontally, so that I can push everything along, and that looks more rhythmical as well. Okay. Right, I've darkened up a little bit over here and filled in a little bit over there as well, so that I can get a sense of the sort of blending and the rhythm. So now I'm going to get, I said I was going to get a fresh tortillon, turns out I don't have a fresh tortillon. So I haven't ordered them. So I'm using what I can. And I'm sort of, you can see I'm sort of pushing it along. So I'm trying to do it in a way that makes it look fluid, but then also doesn't lose the pattern underneath, which is quite tricky to do. Okay. Done a lot darker on here as well. Probably still go a little bit darker, but I think I'm going to leave it at that for now. As I said earlier, when I come to the end of this, I will probably look at the whole thing and see if there's any areas that I can darken up and blend. I'm just going to show you a little bit of doing the rocks, because that's obviously a key bit in a rock pool. So I'm using H, and I'll also use HB. So on this rock you've got the distortion. The thing with this bit is it's a little tricky, because you've got the texture of the rocks, but you've got the fluidity of the water going over the top. So it's how to get those two elements to look right. So essentially what I'm doing is using an H to start with, as I don't want to go too high and get too much texture too soon. And I'm using it a little bit on the side. And then where I've got the patterns of the water that are white, I'm leaving the white paper, having drawn that area out first beforehand. So I'm going to use a tortillon just to soften that out a little bit. And then I'm going to use an HB to go over the top and get a little bit more depth, as there's quite a lot of depth in there. So you can see there's quite a lot of pressure on there. Squircling. Many of you will be familiar with that word. Basically, not a circle, not a squiggle, something in the middle, randomly moving the end of the pencil but in a very small area, and it gives you a texture, an effective texture. It's the same thing that you do, for those of you that haven't done nature, it's exactly the same technique really as when you're doing clothing or when you're doing texture on skin. And the pencil you use determines how much texture you get. So if I was to do this with a 3B, I would get a lot more texture because there's a lot more graphite content. Because I'm using an HB, there's a bit more medium texture, which is what I want in this case.
So we've got different ways of looking at this, and obviously with all rectangles, all cuboids, opposite faces will be the same shape and the same area. So on another one you might add up, say, the top, the side and the left hand side, and then double it, or take each one, multiply them by 2 and then add them all up. Whoa, what a question. So the volume of this cuboid is 72 metres cubed. Find the missing side of this cuboid and find the surface area. I'll leave you have a minute for that, have a think about it.
Right, okay, let's get tortillon. A used tortillon, if you dab it in like that, you get that kind of effect that you want. And then you can use, as you saw just now, I can use a pointed tip eraser to take out any areas I want to as well. So I can dot that in as well if I want to, just to get that effect on the rock. And then I need to get the depths between these two rocks. So that they stand out.
Doesn't matter which order, does it? And then we're saying we'll put numbers in. So equals length is 6.
A bit more depth on this one.
Yes, that's really that.
Depth in here.
So length times breadth is question mark. Height is 3. So that Wendy, I think, is what you were saying. Yeah. Okay. Next step.
I'm nearly at the end of that one. Right, and then the next thing I will do is darken up here. So I will continue to add more depth. So far I used, just to go through pencils, I used H, now I'm going up with HB, then I'll move up to B, and then I'll continue adding the depth as I go. So, I'm now going to carry on with this and do and get to the end. I'm sort of not far off now. So when I've finished it, I will post it on the Drawing with Heather group page, and I will post this video as well. And I hope you enjoy it. Take care, everyone. Look after yourselves. Bye.